Need for Speed, one of the most iconic racing franchises ever in the history of video games, would see a boatload of entries and sequels in the franchise even up until recent times, that started all the way back in 1994 and is easily one of the longest running series ever in games history. One of the most popular games that really brought the series into the stratosphere would have been on the PlayStation, with the third entry with Need for Speed 3 Hot Pursuit, that took everything that was really good about the original two games but added even more with better graphics, music and just overall gameplay. But they also added in the element of Hot Pursuit mode, allowing you to play either as the cops or be chased by the cops, and it ended up being so successful that that element would later see its way into many different sequels, even more so in recent times. So even the likes of Need for Speed High Stakes, or Road Challenge as it was known here in Europe, which would have been the fourth entry in the series that released on the PlayStation and the PC back then in 1999, also followed similar characteristics from Need for Speed 3. But then moving into the next generation, even if you don't take the Porsche 2000 sequel into account, which was a very different experience within the series itself, but with the new installment on the then new PlayStation 2 platform releasing in 2002, it would only be inevitable to see a sequel to, at the time, the most iconic game probably in the series. So when Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 released, it was highly anticipated. It would also be the sixth installment in the series up to that point, and it would release on the Windows PC, PlayStation 2, Nintendo GameCube and even the Xbox, that would allow players to try and relive all of that classic nostalgia from the PS1 but in a more modern format, and did do a really good job of it. Although at that point, because games and the narrative of how games development was changing, there were a lot of differences, as while it tried to reflect elements seen in old, it didn't have the same structure that previous games would have had, as it didn't have a direct career mode per se to unlock all of the features. Instead it had different kind of scenarios or challenges that you had to compete in order to unlock everything within the game, which there are quite a number of cars available, even hidden cars with some additional upgrades that are classed only for the game itself. So like you could call it like a Need for Speed edition of a particular car that would range from brands and models anywhere from like Vauxhall, Opel, all the way up to Mercedes, Ferrari, Lamborghini and other formats that would have been very well known within the series. When the game did release, it was met with generally favourable reviews, and it was highly praised across the board for its music, its car choices and overall gameplay and design. And for its time, even today when you look at it, it could easily be classed as one of the greatest looking and most graphically impressive racing games seen on the PlayStation 2, and it still holds up really well today. But this Hot Pursuit series would also prove to be the inspiration behind the 2010 edition by Criterion Games under just simply Need for Speed Hot Pursuit that would release on the PS3 and the Xbox 360. Although a very different game, mind you, but it still proved that the series was still popular. So with regards to the overall gameplay, there is a load of different modes available, anything from time trial, multiplayer, challenge modes, but the main emphasis will be on like say a world championship, which would act somewhat as a career mode but has a different take on it, because you have to win races, and depending on your position you can unlock some features, but then you'll have to go back into it and complete it in its outright, which means you'll have to complete all of the objectives within and achieve first place in order to unlock everything within that particular category. But it will also unlock future events to take place in, and they all range from the likes of time trial speed runs to knockout races, one-on-one competitive head-on races, just general races, but even the likes of mini kind of tournaments or championships where you have to acquire points and you have to gain the maximum amount of points possible in order to win the championship leaderboard in that particular category, and which in turn will unlock more tracks and cars to play through. But even from my own experience of playing the game, even looking back, I remember my first experience with this was in one of the local game stores, and they had a preview demo pretty much playing on some of the computers or PlayStation systems that they would have had in the shop that you could try out. And I remember when the game came out, this was on it, so it allowed you to play through a couple of the levels, which was pretty cool. But even going back, I found it a bit of a struggle to get used to, because it was so different from what I had played on the PlayStation 1. And I suppose at the time, because you were still relatively new to the graphical capabilities and just the gameplay elements of the PS2, because when you compare games from the PS1 and PS2, they were very different, not just graphically, but even how the look felt, played, and more particularly with the controls. The controls felt just at the time not as easy to get into. Now looking back, when I go back to play the game now, it's funny how things just click, and I find that with a lot of these older games, they may not have made sense back then, but when you give it time or when you just come back years later, suddenly things just make a lot of sense, and they're a lot easier to play play and get through than they would have been, say, 20 years ago, which is kind of crazy to think. But I suppose games have changed so much within that time. But one thing I have to say, even from spending time recording footage to make this video, I can't get over the level of detail. It is one of the best looking racing games I've ever seen on the PS2. The car lineup is incredible. It does have a great soundtrack, although I will admit it's very, very different and moves away from the static seen in previous Need for Speed games, but I suppose it was more reflective of that time within the early 2000s, as even just the style and trends of music and just society in general was changing. So games would often reflect those elements as well. But this would also be the last Need for Speed game in that type of format that was similar to that scene in the earlier generations. It moved away from more exotic kind of style gameplay that only really focused on more high-end cars, because the next entry in the series would completely change the whole landscape of racing games from that point on, with the tuner car culture with Need for Speed Underground. But to be honest, Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 definitely paved the way for that series to really take shape in the way that it did, because it had really good balance in terms of overall gameplay, graphics. It really is a good solid racer, even now today, and even going back to playing it. It is a lot of fun, very addictive, challenging, yes, but that's what you want. But it's not overly barren or annoying to a point that you'll just find it frustrating. Now, back then it would have been a case where that was a thing, especially if you played earlier Need for Speed games. They are very tough. But I have to say, more so now than even years ago, I'm enjoying playing this game way more now than I did back then, which is kind of crazy to think. So that will definitely give you an idea of how good this game is, what it stands for and what it set, and the groundwork that it laid for everything that was to come after it, which it really did. A very, very cool game, one of the best games I think of this generation in terms of racing games. Often overlooked by everything that came after it, yes, but I still think that this is a really, really good solid title that you definitely should check out, and definitely one of the better classic Need for Speed games. If anything, when we look at it, this would have been the first of a boatload of Need for Speed games that released on the PS2 alone. Like, there was this, there was the first Underground, Underground 2, you had Most Wanted, you had Need for Speed Carbon, there was Need for Speed Pro Street, and then the final one with Need for Speed Undercover, which would be the final entry on the console itself. So there was quite a lot of Need for Speed games to release on the PS2, probably as much as any other console ever. And you'd often have to look back and say that this generation could be classed as the best period for Need for Speed games ever in existence. Now, while for me personally, I still prefer the likes of the PS1 generation with Need for Speed 3, Hot Pursuit and Need for Speed High Stakes. They're two of my favourite Need for Speed games ever. But I can't fault these games here, especially this one, Need for Speed Underground, Underground 2 and Most Wanted more specifically. If anything, Underground 2 and Most Wanted are for me the two best Need for Speed games probably ever made, and they are as much fun to play as ever. And I know I'm not the only one that thinks that, because they are both highly regarded across the board from anyone that's played them over the years, even to the current day. And Need for Speed was so popular at the time that it did create a massive influx of wannabe games and copies from other developers that also wanted to try and capitalise on the success of this unique franchise when it was at its peak at that time. But I would still recommend Need for Speed Hot Pursuit 2 without question. It's a very good solid game. It is much fun to play now as it was all those years ago. Definitely worth a try in my book. And I would love to know your thoughts of this unique game, and what did you think of it overall? Would it be your favourite game on the PlayStation 2, or what other games in the series would be your favourite? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content that I have created on other Need for Speed games that were released on the PS2, then you can check out this playlist right here.